Picture a warm October morning in 1944, somewhere in the waters east of the Philippines, when a young lieutenant named Yukio Seki climbed into the cockpit of a Mitsubishi Zero loaded with a 500-pound bomb, and instead of releasing that bomb over an enemy ship, he flew the entire aircraft and himself straight into the flight deck of the escort carrier USS St. And within minutes the ship was a column of fire and smoke sinking beneath the waves, and in that instant the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it had found the answer to a war it was already losing, and it had not. And over the next 10 months this single decision would consume nearly 4,000 of Japan's most precious remaining aviators for a fraction of the victory its architects had promised. And this is the story of how that happened. By the autumn of 1944, Japan's naval air power was not simply weakened, it was gutted, and the wound went back months, to June of that year, when American carrier pilots met the cream of Japan's remaining naval aviators over the Philippine Sea and shot them out of the sky in such lopsided numbers that American flyers themselves nicknamed the encounter the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And in a single afternoon, Japan lost hundreds of aircraft and, more importantly, the veteran pilots who could never be replaced because, unlike the United States, which had built an assembly line pipeline of flight schools churning out competent aviators by the thousand, Japan's pre-war training system had always prized a small number of elite flyers cultivated over years. And once those men were gone, there was no fast way to grow more. And so by October, when American forces stormed ashore at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, the First Air Fleet, the force meant to contest the skies over one of the most important battles of the entire Pacific War could muster barely 40 combat-ready aircraft, a number so small it bordered on absurd for the scale of the fight unfolding beneath it. And it was into this vacuum that Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi stepped, a man who had spent his entire career building Japanese naval aviation from its earliest days, who had actually opposed the attack on Pearl Harbor because he feared exactly this kind of unwinnable war of attrition, and who now found himself commanding an air fleet that existed mostly on paper. And when he met with his staff and pilots at Mabalacat Air Base on the night of October 19th, he did not pretend the situation was anything other than desperate. He told them plainly that conventional bombing runs, flown by exhausted and often poorly trained crews against increasingly lethal American anti-aircraft defenses and combat air patrols, were simply not accurate enough to matter, that a bomb dropped by a shaking hand from a damaged, flak-riddled aircraft would likely miss anyway, so why not turn the aircraft itself into the weapon? Why not remove the guesswork of bombing entirely and guide the explosive to its target with the one guidance system Japan still had in abundance, human will? And he proposed organizing Zero fighters armed with 250-kilogram bombs into a Spatial Attack Corps, the Takutai, whose pilots would deliberately crash into American carriers. And though isolated suicide crashes by desperate individual pilots had happened before, this was different. This was doctrine, ordered from above, systematized, and volunteers were asked for, and in the mythology that followed, nearly every hand in the room was said to have gone up. And 6 days later, on the 25th of October 1944, Lieutenant Seki led 5 bomb-laden Zeros, escorted by Japan's leading fighter ace, toward the American escort carriers screening the Leyte landings. And though most of those 5 aircraft were shot down or missed their targets entirely, Seki's own plane found the flight deck of the St. Lo, and the resulting explosion tore the ship apart and sent it to the bottom within half an hour. And for a Japanese high command starved of good news, this was electrifying. Here at last was proof that a single pilot, a single aircraft, could sink a warship that dozens of conventional bombing runs had failed to touch, and the tactic that had begun as an act of desperation was suddenly being treated as a discovery, a doctrine to be scaled up and industrialized, and scale up it did because in the 4 months following that first attack, from October 1944 through January 1945, American naval analysts studying the raids found something remarkable, that kamikaze attacks were hitting their targets roughly 7 to 10 times more often than conventional bombing or torpedo runs, with over a third of kamikaze sorties actually striking a ship compared to barely 2% for standard attacks, and to a Japanese command drowning in a war of dwindling aircraft, dwindling pilots, and dwindling fuel. That math looked less like a horror and more like an efficiency, because if a single trained pilot in a single expendable aircraft could achieve what 10 conventional missions could not, then perhaps the arithmetic of an unwinnable war could be rebalanced. And the planners who embraced this doctrine were not fools. They understood exactly what they were asking of the young men who volunteered or were assigned, or in many documented cases, quietly pressured into these units. They were promising that Japan's diminishing air strength, poured into precision-guided human bombs, could inflict such catastrophic losses on the American fleet that the United States would recoil from the cost of invading the home islands and negotiate a peace rather than bleed itself further, that a nation which could not outproduce America in aircraft carriers might still outwill it in sacrifice. And this was the seductive logic that carried the kamikaze campaign from a single carrier's sinking off Samar to a strategy that would eventually consume the last reserves of Japanese naval and army aviation. And as the war moved from the Philippines to Okinawa in the spring of 1945, the doctrine metastasized into something even larger and more organized. Mass formations called kikusui, or floating chrysanthemums, sent wave after wave, sometimes hundreds of aircraft, in a single operation against the enormous American invasion fleet gathered off Okinawa's coast. And by this point, the pool of pilots feeding these attacks had changed dramatically. No longer were these exclusively the seasoned aviators of 1944. Now training pipelines had been compressed to weeks instead of years, and boys barely out of secondary school, many from the Yokorin Preparatory Flight Training Program, some as young as 17, were given only the barest instruction needed to take off, hold formation, and fly in a straight line toward an enemy ship, because that was, chillingly, all the mission required. There was no need to teach evasive maneuvers, no need to teach a safe landing, no need to teach gunnery, and this brutal efficiency of training was itself part of the doctrine's appeal to planners who could no longer afford the years it took to build a real combat aviator, and Japan's aircraft industry, straining under American submarine blockades and the relentless bombing of factories, began producing aircraft that reflected the same desperate calculus, poorly built, sometimes made partly of wood, sometimes obsolete trainer planes repurposed as flying bombs, and alongside these came the most chilling piece of hardware to emerge from the entire campaign, the Oka, a small rocket-powered glider bomb carrying over a ton of explosives with no landing gear and no possibility of return, that was carried partway to its target, slung beneath a heavy bomber, and then released, its pilot then igniting the rocket motors and steering the glider into a terminal dive far faster than any conventional kamikaze aircraft could achieve, a weapon so nakedly built for one-way flight that American sailors who encountered it gave it the mocking nickname Baka, the Japanese word for fool. And yet, for all this innovation, for all the organizational energy poured into scaling the tactic, the returns were diminishing even as The human cost climbed because the U.S. Navy adapted with brutal speed. Radar picket destroyers were pushed out ahead of the main fleet to provide early warning and absorb the first waves of attacks. Fighter direction and combat air patrols grew more sophisticated, anti-aircraft gunnery improved, and proximity-fused shells that detonated near an incoming aircraft rather than requiring a direct hit became standard, and the statistics tell the story starkly off Okinawa of the roughly 800 kamikaze sorties analyzed by American naval researchers. Only about a quarter actually struck a ship, a real decline from the campaign's opening months, meaning that even as Japan threw more and more of its remaining aviation strength into the effort, the marginal effectiveness of each successive wave was falling. The Americans were learning faster than the Japanese could adapt, and meanwhile, the ships being sunk were increasingly not the aircraft carriers and battleships the Doctrine had originally promised to destroy, but destroyers, picket ships, transports, the smaller vessels standing at the perimeter of the fleet, who bore the brunt because they were positioned to be hit first, which meant the campaign was in effect killing American sailors on the war's smaller ships in appalling numbers, while barely scratching the actual capital ships whose destruction had been the entire justification for the sacrifice in the first place. And by the time Okinawa's brutal 3-month campaign ended in June of 1945, several dozen Allied vessels across the whole Kamikaze campaign had been sunk and many more damaged. More than 7,000 Allied naval personnel had been killed by these attacks, a genuinely staggering toll that terrified American commanders planning the eventual invasion of Japan itself. And this fear, this demonstrated willingness of Japan to keep sending pilots to their deaths in ever greater numbers, would go on to shape some of the darkest calculations of the war's final months. But the price Japan itself paid was scarcely less catastrophic. An estimated 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in these attacks, and that figure does not capture the thousands more conventional aviators lost trying to escort or support them, nor does it capture what those losses meant for a nation trying and failing to rebuild any kind of credible air force, because every pilot funneled into a one-way mission was a pilot who could never train the next generation of aviators, could never pass along hard-won combat experience, could never form the backbone of a defense against the invasion everyone in Tokyo now understood was coming. And so the doctrine that had been sold as a way to preserve Japan's fighting strength by making every remaining aircraft count for more than it could through conventional means was, in the brutal accounting of the war's final year, doing the opposite, hollowing out what remained of Japan's aviation capability at the exact moment that capability would have been most needed to defend the home islands. And the men making these decisions were not blind to this. Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, who commanded much of the later kamikaze effort, kept a wartime diary revealing a man who understood perfectly well the mathematics were not working in Japan's favor, and yet the machinery of sacrifice, once built, proved almost impossible to dismantle, because to stop would be to admit that thousands of young men had already died for nothing, and no one in the chain of command wanted to be the one to say that out loud. And so the attacks continued, even as Japan's supply of aircraft dwindled toward nothing, even as fuel shortages meant training flights themselves became rare luxuries, even as the once proud Imperial Japanese Navy's surface fleet had already been broken as a fighting force after the disasters at Leyte Gulf, leaving kamikaze aircraft as almost the only offensive weapon Japan had left to throw at the approaching Americans. And when the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 and the Soviet declaration of war finally forced Japan's surrender, Vice Admiral Ugaki himself flew one final, unauthorized kamikaze mission on the very day of the surrender broadcast, taking off with a small group of aircraft in a gesture that changed nothing about the war's outcome, but underscored just how deeply the doctrine of sacrifice had embedded itself in the psychology of Japan's military leadership, even at the absolute end. And Onishi, the man who had first organized the Special Attack Corps at Mabalakat, did not wait for the formal surrender ceremony. On the night of August 15, 1945, he committed ritual suicide, seppuku, and in the hours before his death, without the mercy of a second to end his suffering quickly, he wrote a final letter of apology to the roughly 4,000 young men he had sent to die in aircraft that were never coming back, urging the survivors of Japan to work for peace and to remember the sacrifice not as glory, but as a warning. And that admission from the doctrine's own architect tells you almost everything you need to know about how the promise and the reality of the Kamikaze campaign had diverged, because Onishi and the planners around him had promised a strategic reversal, a devastating enough toll on the American fleet that the price of victory would become too high to bear, and instead what they achieved was a horrifying but ultimately indecisive toll. Several dozen ships sunk against an American Navy that could still put hundreds of vessels to sea, 7,000 American dead against an invasion force of hundreds of thousands. Painful, yes. Terrifying to witness, yes, but never remotely close to the war-ending shock the doctrine's champions had promised when they first watched the St. Lo vanish beneath the waves off Samar. And in exchange for that partial, insufficient toll, Japan had spent nearly 4,000 of its remaining trained aviators, along with the industrial effort to build their aircraft, the fuel to fly them, and the irreplaceable time it would have taken to train the next generation of pilots who now will never exist. A nation cannibalizing its own future in the hope of forcing a miracle in the present, and the miracle never came. And so the Kamikaze campaign stands today as one of the starkest lessons in the entire history of military doctrine, a demonstration that a tactic can be locally effective, can rack up genuinely impressive hit rates against unprepared defenses, and still be a strategic catastrophe for the side that adopts it, because effectiveness against individual ships is not the same as effectiveness against an entire war machine. And the men who built the doctrine understood the arithmetic of desperation so well that they mistook it for the arithmetic of victory, and in doing so, they built not a weapon that saved Japan, but a machine that quietly finished the work America's carriers had already begun, grinding down the last of Japan's trained pilots in exchange for a toll that, however tragic, never came close to matching the promise made in that quiet briefing room in Mabalakat on the night of October 19th, 1944, when a small group of exhausted men decided that the only strength they had left to offer was themselves. And in the end, that offering, repeated nearly 4,000 times, bought Japan not survival, but only a longer, costlier road to the same defeat it had been trying so desperately to avoid.